When two guards tried to move a black Marine from his son's graduation, no one expected 6 Navy SEALs to rise from the crowd and stop the entire room without saying a word. Solomon Drayton didn't expect anyone to recognize him when he pulled into the parking lot behind Elmridge High. The building looked like most high schools in smaller Texas towns: weathered red brick, a few flags fluttering over the entrance, kids loitering near the gym doors. It was already crowded. Parents in dress shirts, siblings holding signs, a grandmother leaning on a walker. It was all there. He parked his Dodge Charger near the chain-link fence and stepped out, smoothing the lines of his deep blue Marine uniform. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, not because he was trying to show off, but because there were things he didn't know how to do halfway. He looked around. His posture stood out, upright and firm. His face, though calm, carried the stillness of someone who had seen life from too many angles. He had driven 8 hours from Temple to make it to his son's high school graduation. He could have flown, but the Charger was his wife's favorite car, and even after her passing 2 years ago, he still felt closer to her on the road. Solomon opened the car door and pulled out a small photograph from the glove compartment. It was old and worn, with a slight tear in the corner, his wife holding Tyron when he was just a baby. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I promised you," he said softly. "I wouldn't miss it." The walk to the entrance was slow and intentional. Every step carried meaning. His chest filled with something he didn't have a name for, but it lived somewhere between pride and ache. Inside, the gym was packed. Metal chairs filled the floor, bleachers already overflowing. The air smelled faintly of concession popcorn and floor wax. It was noisy, chaotic, alive. Solomon showed his printed ticket to a volunteer near the door, a short man with a clipboard and headset. The man squinted at it, nodded quickly, and pointed toward the 3rd row on the left side. "You're good to go. Family seating, up front." "Appreciate it," Solomon said, his voice steady. He made his way to the row, catching glimpses of other families as he passed. Some folks looked at him, did a double take at the uniform, then turned away like they hadn't. One woman gave him a small smile, then whispered something to the man beside her. Solomon didn't react. He'd been black, tall, and in uniform for a long time. He knew what some looks meant and what others didn't. He found his seat and sat down. The chair was plastic, slightly wobbly. He adjusted it without complaint. In front of him, the stage was set. Banners hung across the gym wall, Class of 2024 in big silver letters. A few school board members stood near the podium, checking notes. Solomon glanced at the rows of students lined up at the far end of the gym. Tyron was somewhere in the middle, tall, lanky, with his mother's eyes. 18 years gone just like that. He remembered holding him the night he was born, still in uniform, dirt still under his fingernails. He'd flown in from Okinawa with only 4 days' leave. And now, here they were. He sat still, barely blinking, soaking in the moment. Behind him, people continued filing in. Chairs scraped, programs rustled, someone laughed too loud. A man dropped his coffee and muttered under his breath. None of it touched Solomon. His world was narrowed to the stage, the rows of young faces and the weight of the photo against his chest. Then the music started. Pomp and circumstance. And the crowd rose to their feet. A few students looked nervous, others beamed. Solomon stood too, shoulders squared, arms at his sides. The national anthem followed. Everyone placed hands over hearts. Solomon didn't move. He didn't need to. His whole presence was a salute. He thought of his wife again, how she would have cried through the whole ceremony, how she would have fixed Tyron's tie 3 times before letting him leave the house. His eyes stayed forward. But as the last note of the anthem faded, 2 uniformed men began walking down the side aisle, and they were heading straight for him. The 2 security guards moved with purpose. They weren't police. Their badges read Harlan Security Services, and their uniforms were standard. Black polo shirts tucked into cargo pants, earpieces, radios on their belts. Neither of them looked older than 30. One was short and wide-shouldered, with a shaved head and a tight expression. The other was taller, lanky, and chewing gum like he had somewhere better to be. Solomon noticed them right away, but didn't flinch. His training taught him long ago that stillness was often more commanding than movement. He kept his eyes forward, his hands resting loosely on his thighs. The shorter guard stopped beside him and leaned down just enough to be heard. "Excuse me, sir," he said in a low voice. "We're gonna need you to come with us." Solomon slowly turned his head. "Is there a problem?" The tall one stepped forward. "Yeah, this section's for families of graduating seniors." Solomon blinked, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the same printed ticket he'd shown at the door. "This is my seat. 3rd row, left side. Family seating. Confirmed." The shorter guard didn't even look at the ticket. "We got told it's full." Solomon didn't move. "It was full when I sat down too. You want to tell me who gave that order?" The tall guard shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't expecting a calm, clear voice. "Look, it's not a big deal. There's some extra seats in the back. Let's not make this anything it doesn't have to be." Solomon's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with anger, just quiet calculation. "I drove 8 hours to watch my son walk across that stage. I'll be sitting right here." A few heads had started turning. A woman 2 rows over nudged her husband and nodded toward them. Someone in the bleachers tilted their phone slightly, maybe recording. The short guard straightened up and looked around. "Sir, I'm going to ask one more time." "You can ask all day," Solomon said, his voice lower now, firmer. "I'm not moving." The tall one sucked his teeth. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back. That's all we're saying." And there it was. Solomon looked at him fully now. That phrase wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about policy. It was about something older, something quieter, something that had followed him all his life in boardrooms, waiting rooms, front porches, and even the base cafeteria, just behind a smile, just under a whisper. He didn't respond. The air shifted around them, the way it does when people start sensing a line has been crossed. The short guard noticed it too. He adjusted the radio on his hip and muttered something into the mic, never breaking eye contact. Solomon stayed seated, staring forward like the conversation had ended, because for him, it had. A woman seated beside him, older and pale-skinned, leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "Don't you let them move you." He nodded once, acknowledging her but saying nothing. He didn't want to make a scene. He wanted to watch his son graduate like any other father. But the guards weren't finished. The tall one lowered his voice again. "Look, you got a problem. Take it up with the school office. We got our orders." Solomon turned his head toward him once more. "You have a name, son?" The guard blinked. "It's Officer Malley." "Not officer," Solomon replied. "You're private security." The other one stepped in. "All right, that's enough. If you don't stand up—" He didn't finish the sentence, because that's when the gym door at the far end clicked open, and 6 men walked in. No uniforms, no badges, just firm postures, squared shoulders, and faces that said they'd been through worse things than awkward stares and misjudged instructions. They didn't walk in together. They filtered in, one by one, taking different spots, like they weren't there together. But anyone watching closely could tell. They moved the same, watched the room the same, sat the same. Still, steady and alert. Solomon didn't look back. He didn't have to. He knew exactly who they were, but the guards didn't. At least not yet. And they were about to find out. Solomon kept his focus on the stage. His jaw didn't move, but his mind was turning. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But something inside him clicked into place, like a switch he didn't use unless he had to. The one built for survival, for balance, for patience under pressure. The 2 guards didn't leave. They hovered. It was the kind of hovering that wasn't about doing a job. It was about trying to remind someone they had power. But what they didn't understand was that Solomon had lived in places where power was life or death, not some gym with folding chairs and a sound system. A student name was called from the stage, and the crowd clapped politely. But people weren't really paying attention to the ceremony anymore, not the ones nearby. They were watching the standoff, pretending not to. The taller guard, Malley, shifted his stance again. He leaned closer, voice quieter this time. "I'm trying to do you a favor here, all right? This doesn't need to get ugly. Solomon's eyes flicked to him. You don't have that kind of favor to offer. A pause. Mally drew back slightly, as if reconsidering his next move. But the shorter one, Garvin, according to his badge, was less subtle. He didn't like being challenged. His hand hovered near the radio again. A few rows behind, a man stood up slowly. Nobody noticed at first. He didn't say a word, just crossed his arms and stared. Clean-shaven, broad frame, eyes sharp. He took a seat near the aisle without removing his gaze from the scene in front of him. A second man stood up on the opposite side of the gym. Same posture, calm, intentional. Then a third. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Solomon knew them all. He didn't turn to look because his instincts didn't require confirmation. He had led these men through mud, gunfire, and silence darker than most people could imagine. Garvin leaned down again, this time with something in his voice that wasn't there before. Listen, man, you're making this into a situation. Solomon turned his head, slowly and deliberately. And you're not listening. Garvin's hand twitched toward the radio again, but before he could say a word, a voice broke the tension from 10 feet away. Is there a reason this man's being bothered? It was clear. Calm. Controlled. The kind of voice that doesn't rise to get attention. It drops just enough to make everyone else stop talking. It came from a man standing in the center aisle. Tall, salt and pepper beard, fitted black coat over a grey shirt. His name was Creed Marston. He was the one Solomon had pulled from the wreckage in Kandahar, dragging him across 200 yards of sand while bullets rained down like gravel. Garvin looked up, caught off guard. Who are you? Creed didn't answer. He stepped forward once. I asked you a question. Mally raised a hand. Sir, we've got this under control. No, Creed said, sharper now. You don't. Another man stood up from the far bleachers. Then another. 4 of them now. Solomon remained seated, still quiet. The entire left side of the gym was now watching openly. A boy pointed. A teacher tried to wave attention back to the stage, but nobody was looking at the diplomas anymore. Creed took one more step forward. You're embarrassing yourselves, and you're one breath away from making this worse. Garvin glanced at Mally, who looked less confident by the second. It was clear now. They hadn't expected backup. Especially not backup like this. I don't care what your orders were, Creed said. You don't put your hands on that man. You don't tell him to move. You don't ask again. The silence in the gym felt tight. The kind that didn't come from fear, but respect. A quiet respect that started to swell as more people realized what was happening. Solomon finally looked up at Creed and gave the smallest nod. Not a thank you. Not a request. Just recognition. Creed's eyes softened for a moment. Then he stepped back and took his seat again, arms folded. But the tension hadn't left the air. Not yet. And the people watching were waiting to see what the guards would do next. The gym faded. The stage, the banners, the faces, all blurred into the background of Solomon's mind. His eyes were still open, but his memory yanked him backward. 15 years ago, Afghanistan. It was late afternoon in Kandahar province. The sun didn't set gently there. It crashed down like a hammer, turning the sand to rust and the air to steel. Solomon, a gunnery sergeant back then, had just finished briefing his unit when everything went sideways. A roadside IED blew under their convoy, flipping the lead Humvee like a toy. Dirt and metal rained down before anyone could scream. Then came the gunfire. Not scattered. Coordinated. Solomon didn't think. He moved. He ducked behind what was left of a door frame, surveying the chaos. Smoke clouded the edge of the valley, but he saw 6 men down, trapped behind the burning wreckage of a second vehicle. Most were pinned. One was already trying to crawl forward, dragging another by the vest. That was Creed Marston. He had just 3 months in country and a bullet through his thigh. Solomon bolted. No hesitation, no radio call. He ran through open ground, dodging bursts of gunfire, sliding into cover behind a blown axle. Creed looked up, blood on his temple, gasping. You're bleeding, Solomon had said. You noticed? Creed coughed. Solomon grabbed the straps of the downed soldier beside him, Enrique Soto, and began pulling. Creed pushed from behind, wincing with every inch. "Where's Divas?" Solomon shouted. Creed pointed weakly. "Left side, under the hood." That's when Solomon saw him. A young SEAL pinned under part of the engine block, leg trapped. He was yelling for help, but too far gone to move. Without pausing, Solomon told Creed, "You keep low and move when I move." Creed nodded. That's when he really started to understand what leadership looked like. Solomon sprinted across again. His foot hit gravel, then bone, but he didn't stop. He slid to Divas, crouched low, and gripped the edge of the mangled hood with both hands. It wouldn't budge. "Gunny, don't!" Divas shouted. I'm good. You're not staying here." Solomon braced one foot, dug deep, and lifted. His shoulders strained, his ribs ached. The metal groaned, but it rose, just enough for Divas to yank his leg free. They fell back together, crawling toward the ridgeline. Gunfire cracked overhead. Creed returned with Soto limping on his good leg. 2 others followed. Lim and Horton, faces blackened with ash, rifles at the ready. When the firing stopped, there were no cheers, no victory speech, just silence and breathing. All 6 of them were alive. Solomon was the last to check out. He stayed on rear watch until the dust settled and the medevac arrived. He didn't speak for a long time after that. But Creed remembered. They all did. After that day, there was never a doubt. If Solomon asked for anything, anywhere, anytime, they'd be there. No matter what. Back in the gym, Creed sat quietly in his chair, eyes fixed on the guards still standing near Solomon. He wasn't thinking about war. He was thinking about promises. The man who had dragged him out of a war zone was now being harassed in front of a high school stage for trying to watch his son graduate. He clenched his fists. Another SEAL, Javier Meeks, walked in and sat 4 rows back. Then Zachary Wells found a spot along the right side bleachers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Solomon glanced toward the back of the gym now, just briefly. His eyes met Meeks. That was enough. But the guards didn't understand what those looks meant. Not yet. And the moment they made the next move, they'd learn real fast. The ceremony pressed on, at least on the surface. Names were still being called. Families clapped, some too loudly, trying to cover up the tension that now thickened the air. But the attention had shifted. Eyes that had once been glued to the stage now kept drifting toward the 3rd row on the left, where Solomon Drayton sat like a statue, and 2 guards stood like they didn't know what to do next. Garvin glanced toward the front where a school official tried to get his attention. The woman looked nervous, mouthing something and gesturing subtly toward the guards. But Garvin shook his head. He wasn't ready to walk away. He'd started something, and his ego didn't know how to back down. Malley shifted his weight again, his jaw working harder now on the gum, clearly uncomfortable. But he hadn't walked away either. "Sir," Garvin said again, this time louder. "This is your last warning." Solomon didn't move. "To do what exactly?" Garvin stepped forward, leaning in so close his belt brushed Solomon's knee. "To stop making a scene. We don't want any trouble. Just move to the back." Solomon turned his head and looked him dead in the eye. "You're the only one causing trouble." Garvin's nostrils flared. That's when it slipped. "You think wearing that uniform makes you better than everybody else? This is a high school, man, not your base." A hush fell across the rows around them. A little girl stopped squirming in her seat. A dad with a camera froze mid-zoom. Even Malley took a half step back, like the words had landed heavier than he expected. Solomon didn't blink. He took a breath, not to calm himself, but to stay grounded. "You need to walk away." Garvin didn't. Instead, his hand dropped to the front of his belt, not on a weapon, but near enough to feel threatening. And that's when Creed stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. He just stepped into the aisle, slow and focused, like the conversation had become his business now. The gym wasn't dead silent, but close. Creed's voice was clear. "If you touch him, you'll answer to me." Garvin turned his head. "And who the hell are you?" Creed took another step forward. "The man who's telling you this ends right now." One of the school board members noticed what was happening and whispered something to the principal. An assistant principal got up and started moving toward the back of the gym, probably calling someone on the walkie clipped to her side. The school staff was finally realizing this wasn't going to die down quietly. More SEALs rose from their seats, spread across the room. No formation, no spoken cue, just a unified instinct that kicked in all at once. By now, all 6 were standing. Garvin looked around, realizing they weren't just dealing with some angry parent. Something was different. These men didn't fidget. They didn't shift from foot to foot. Their presence filled the space like pressure before a storm. Creed took a step closer. You've got 2 choices. Walk away now, or watch this go somewhere you don't want it to go. Mally's voice finally cracked through. Let's just back off, man. But Garvin still hesitated. Solomon spoke again, not to Garvin, but to Creed. Don't waste your breath. He already made his decision. Creed didn't smile. He just lowered his voice one last time. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Finally, Garvin stepped back. Not much, but enough. His hand dropped away from his belt. His face burned, but he was outnumbered and outclassed. The principal appeared near the aisle, whispering quickly to the guards. Whatever she said was quiet, but firm enough to send them both walking toward the back exit. They didn't look at anyone on their way out. Solomon exhaled, slow and steady. Creed sat back down without a word. All 6 SEALs remained standing. But the moment still hung in the air, and Tyron Drayton was watching everything from the lineup of students, his hands clenched at his sides. Tyron Drayton was near the center of the graduating class, standing in line between a girl with bright braids and a boy whose gown kept slipping off his shoulders. They were trying to focus on the ceremony, laughing nervously and checking their name cards like the world was normal. But Tyron's world wasn't. He had seen the 2 guards walking toward his father from the minute the anthem ended. At first he thought maybe it was just routine. Maybe they were helping someone find a seat. But something in his chest told him different. Then he saw the way his dad sat. So still, so composed, but locked in. He'd seen that look before. The same one he'd caught when he was 12 and came home crying because someone at school had said something they shouldn't have. His dad didn't raise his voice then either. He just sat with that same expression, like steel that refused to bend. Tyron kept his eyes on the scene as best he could. From his place in line, he couldn't hear what was said, but the body language told him enough. He saw the guards standing too close, saw his father calmly staying seated, and then he saw a man stand up, a tall guy in a dark coat. And somehow Tyron knew. That wasn't just a parent. That man knew his father. The way he moved, the way he placed himself between the guard and the row, it was clear. He wasn't there for drama. He was there for Solomon Drayton. Then another man stood, and another. It wasn't loud, but it was like the temperature in the room shifted. Everyone was watching now. Tyron's heart beat faster. He wasn't scared. He was something else, torn between pride and fire. He had grown up hearing pieces of his dad's service stories, not the gory parts. His dad kept most of those to himself. But bits here and there. A buddy who sent Christmas cards every year. A scar that came from somewhere out in the dust. A box in the garage marked Kandahar that nobody ever opened. He never knew the names, never saw the faces. But now they were here, standing like they'd been waiting for this moment, like they'd never stopped having his dad's back. Tyron blinked hard, pushing down the burn behind his eyes. He didn't want to cry. Not here. Not now. The line moved forward. A few names were called. The clapping picked back up slowly, like someone had hit play again after a pause. But the room wasn't the same anymore. The energy had shifted. It wasn't about balloons or banners now. It was about respect. One of the assistant principals tapped Tyron's shoulder and said something he didn't hear. He just nodded. The student next to him leaned over and whispered, "That your dad?" Tyron didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The entire gym had seen it. And now, everyone in that building understood what kind of man Solomon Drayton was. In the audience, Creed remained standing. He didn't look around for approval. He wasn't scanning for attention. He was watching Solomon, still seated in the same plastic chair, hands resting on his lap, eyes locked on the stage like nothing had happened. But something had. The rest of the SEALs stayed on their feet too, not posturing, just present. Their silence spoke louder than any microphone ever could. A few parents clapped louder now with each name, almost as if they were trying to make up for the tension earlier. The gym had become a living thing, stirred awake by a moment of injustice, held steady by the weight of honor. Solomon remained still, not defiant, not bitter, just present, a father watching his son take one more step into adulthood. But the moment that would break through all of it was still coming, and when Tyron's name was finally called, the room wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. The line was moving faster now. Some students were still fidgeting, adjusting caps, whispering jokes under their breath, trying to enjoy the moment. But Tyron wasn't in that space anymore. His mind kept flashing back to his father, sitting alone, surrounded by faces, but completely centered in that chair like it had been built just for him. There was something about how he held himself, calm, quiet, unshakable, and something about the way those men, those warriors, rose around him without needing to be asked. Tyron realized for the first time that he didn't really know the full weight his father carried. Sure, he'd seen the pictures, the medals in the old wooden box, the folded flag tucked into the bookshelf in the living room. But those things never really spoke. They just sat there like relics. Today they walked. Today they stood. The assistant principal called out the next name, then another. Tyron was 3 people away from the stage. He wiped his palms on his gown, tried to slow his breathing. The girl in front of him turned and grinned nervously. "You ready?" Tyron smiled a little. "More than you know." He stepped forward. On the other side of the gym, Solomon leaned slightly forward. His eyes never left the stage. He didn't clap for every student, not out of disrespect, but because his focus had narrowed to the boy in the black robe with the red and white honor cords. The boy who looked so much like his mother when he smiled. 1 name. 2 names. Then the announcer paused for a second, cleared her throat, and spoke with a bit more weight than before. "Tyron Drayton," the name echoed. There was a beat of silence. Half a second, maybe less, before the room erupted. Clapping, whistling, cheering. But what stood out wasn't the volume. It was the rhythm of it. The sound wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, coordinated, deep. The 6 SEALs, still standing, raised their hands and applauded in perfect unison. Each one clapped with force, not performance. A salute without the salute. A gesture that said, "We see you. We see your father. We honor both." Tyron walked across the stage slowly, chin high, steps steady. His heart pounded, but it wasn't nerves. It was pride. And not just pride in himself. It was the pride of knowing exactly who his father was and what it meant to carry that last name. He took his diploma from the principal, shook her hand, and turned toward the audience. His eyes scanned for one person. Found him. Solomon didn't wave, didn't stand. He just met his son's eyes and gave the smallest, most meaningful smile of the day. Tyron nodded once and stepped off the stage. The applause still hadn't died down. Parents who hadn't said a word all ceremony were now clapping hard. Some stood. A few wiped their eyes, not sure exactly why, but feeling like they'd just witnessed something that mattered. Solomon sat back in his chair and let the moment wash over him. He wasn't the kind of man to cry in public. But inside, something loosened. Not grief, not pain, just release. The kind that only comes when the circle feels complete, even if it never really is. The other names continued. But something had shifted. From that moment on, every student who walked the stage walked in the echo of what had just happened. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was viral, but because it was real. But the story didn't end with the applause. And when father and son met again outside the gym, it would be more than just a proud hug. It would be the passing of something deeper. The final name was called 20 minutes later. Everyone stood as the graduating class threw their caps, screamed with relief, and hugged like they hadn't seen each other in years. Phones went up, cameras clicked, and balloons bobbed above the crowd as the students began filing out through the gym's double doors toward the back lot. Solomon didn't move right away. He sat quietly as the noise swelled around him, soaking it all in. The music, the laughter, the flash of silver and red gowns sweeping by. His eyes followed Tyrion as he disappeared into the hallway with his classmates. A teacher gave him a high five. Another pulled him in for a side hug. But even with all the chaos, Tyrion turned once, just once, and looked back. Solomon caught it. A brief glance, but it held everything. "Did you see me?" And Solomon's expression gave the answer, every second. The crowd began to thin. People shuffled out with flowers and balloons, congratulating each other in loud bursts. Solomon stood slowly, stretching his legs, feeling the weight of sitting in one position for too long. Creed walked over as the gym emptied. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Solomon, then toward the exit. "You okay?" Creed finally asked. Solomon nodded. "I've been through worse." Creed smiled slightly. "Yeah, but it still shouldn't have happened." "No," Solomon said. "It shouldn't have." Another SEAL, Javier Meeks, joined them. "We tried to stay low-key, but once that guy put his hand near his belt—" Solomon raised a hand gently. "You all did what needed to be done. That was enough." The three men stood there for a few seconds longer, letting the noise drain from the room. Then Solomon said, "I want to see my boy." Outside, the sun was fierce against the concrete, casting long shadows from the bleachers onto the back lot. Students were scattered in small clusters, posing for photos, throwing their caps again, calling out to relatives. Tyrion stood near the flagpole, his gown half unzipped, the diploma folder in one hand and his phone in the other. When he saw his father approach, he stopped mid-conversation. The crowd around him faded into the background. They met halfway. Tyrion was the first to speak. "You okay?" Solomon nodded. "You? Yeah," Tyrion said, then looked down for a second. "They tried to move you." "I know." Tyrion's jaw flexed. "I was ready to walk off that stage, Dad. I swear I was 2 seconds from saying something." Solomon placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "And that's why you didn't." Tyrion looked up. "What do you mean?" "Because you knew I could handle it. And because you handled your moment like a man. You didn't let anybody take it from you." Tyrion held his breath for a second. "Who were those guys that stood up?" Solomon glanced behind him. The 6 SEALs were now outside, too, gathered near the exit, talking quietly. They weren't looking for attention, just keeping an eye out, like always. "They're men I bled with, men who know what loyalty means," Solomon said. "Men who don't forget." Tyrion nodded slowly. "That was powerful. It was necessary," Solomon replied. "Sometimes silence is louder than shouting, and sometimes standing up without speaking says more than 1,000 words." For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Tyrion smiled. "You gonna tell me those war stories now?" Solomon chuckled. "Some of them. You're old enough for the real parts now." They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, not just father and son. 2 men connected by something that couldn't be explained, only lived. Across the lot, Creed raised a hand. Not a wave, just a gesture of respect. Tyrion returned it without hesitation. The sun kept climbing, but for the Drayton men, time moved differently now. But one more moment remained, because after all that, the real lesson hadn't yet been spoken aloud. Most of the crowd had cleared by the time Solomon and Tyrion walked back to the parking lot. A few families still lingered, laughing around folding chairs or loading up trunks with flower arrangements and graduation gifts. But the buzz had quieted, and the sun had softened into early evening light. Solomon unlocked the Charger, the same one his wife used to drive to parent-teacher meetings and weekend road trips. Tyrion paused at the passenger door, running his fingers along a scratch near the handle. "She would have been screaming the loudest today," he said softly. "She would have made you retake every photo until your smile looked just right." Solomon replied, managing a grin. They climbed in, shutting the doors behind them. The car was warm from the sun, but it felt like a cocoon, sealed off from the rest of the world for a few breaths. Tyrion turned to face his father. "I gotta ask, why didn't you say anything to those guards? You just sat there." Solomon tapped the steering wheel once, then turned to him. "Because I don't have to stand up for who I am, and I don't need to raise my voice to be heard." Tyron looked out the window for a second, chewing on that. You know how many times in my life I've had to choose between letting something slide or blowing it up? Solomon continued. That moment today, what those men tried to do, it wasn't new, but how we respond. That's what defines us. But they disrespected you, Tyron said, in front of everybody. Yes, Solomon said, and everyone saw it. But they also saw the truth. They saw 6 men who had every reason to be somewhere else stand up, not because I asked, because they knew what that moment meant. Tyron sat with that. Son, Solomon said, life will hand you 100 chances to react with anger, and sometimes anger is justified, but most times silence cuts deeper, dignity sticks longer. That's what people remember. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded photo, the one of Tyron as a baby, his late wife cradling him. I carried this with me through Kandahar. I carried it through losing your mom. And I carried it here today. Not because it gives me strength, but because it reminds me of what's worth protecting. Tyron's voice dropped. You always knew who had your back. Solomon smiled. I didn't need to know. I just had faith. Real men don't vanish when things get uncomfortable. They show up, and they stand. There was a pause before Tyron spoke again. I want to be like that. Like you. You already are, Solomon said. You walked that stage with pride. You didn't let anger steal your moment. You stayed grounded, even when everything around you was trying to throw you off balance. Outside the car, the last of the SEALs were getting into their vehicles. Creed gave one last look toward the Charger before driving off. Solomon nodded once. No words, just the quiet acknowledgement of something permanent. Tyron leaned back in the seat. So what now? Solomon turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life. Now we drive home. You get to choose dinner. Tyron grinned. Waffle House? Solomon chuckled. Of course. As they pulled out of the lot, the school faded behind them. But the memory of what happened inside that gym wouldn't fade anytime soon, for anyone who was there. And for Tyron, that day would mark something far greater than a diploma. It was the day he realized manhood had nothing to do with noise and everything to do with how you carry yourself when the world stops watching. Some people shout to be seen. Others just sit in silence and are never forgotten. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded what true strength looks like.